Welcome back to History's Greatest Crimes. I'm Michael.
And I'm Alana. We're your guides as we navigate history's darkest corridors, sifting through the ashes of the past, not just for the thrill, but for the truth. We're transporting you today to New York City, the vibrant, bustling metropolis of 1911. But beneath the glitter and the promise of the Gilded Age, a different reality was brewing. Imagine a city teeming with immigrants chasing the American dream, only to find themselves trapped in a nightmare. We're going to talk about a tragedy that unfolded not on a battlefield, not in the shadowy halls of political intrigue, but in a seemingly ordinary garment factory. What happened there became a pivotal moment in history, forever changing the labor laws in the United States.
On March 25th, 1911, a fire erupted on the top floors of the Ash Building, the home of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, located near Washington State Park. The flames spread with terrifying speed, trapping workers, mostly young immigrant women, inside. Within minutes, a typical workday turned into a scene of unimaginable horror and death.
The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, as it came to be known, claimed the lives of 146 people. Many leapt to their deaths from the 8th, 9th, and 10th floors rather than face the inferno raging inside. It was a catastrophe that shocked the nation, exposing the brutal conditions that countless workers endured in the early 20th century. But it's important to note this wasn't just a horrific accident, it was also a crime.
So buckle up. This episode isn't just about recounting a tragedy. We're going to dissect the social and political climate that allowed the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire to happen. We'll examine the lives of the victims, the actions of the owners, and the investigation that followed. We're also going to explore the crucial role of activists and reformers who seized upon this tragedy to fight for change.
We're going to ask the tough questions. Who was truly responsible? How did this fire ignite a movement for workers' rights? And why, over a century later, does this story still resonate with such power? Join us as we unravel the haunting, heartbreaking, and ultimately transformative crime of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. Welcome back. Before we can truly understand the horror of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, we need to paint a picture of the world that birthed it. Imagine New York City in the early 1900s, a pressure cooker of ambition, innovation, and desperation.
Exactly. It was a city of stark contrasts, a place where skyscrapers were starting to pierce the sky, while below, in the shadows of progress, a different story was unfolding. Millions of immigrants, chasing the promise of a new life, poured into the city, fueling a booming industrial revolution. By 1909, quote, garment production was the largest manufacturing business in America's largest industrial city, end quote. Can you imagine the scale of it, Alana?
It's mind-boggling, Michael. And at the heart of this industrial boom was the garment industry, specifically the production of the shirtwaist. Now, for our listeners who might not be familiar, the shirtwaist was essentially a woman's blouse, but it was more than just a piece of clothing. This wasn't just any blouse. It was a symbol of the changing times, a garment that, as one historian put it, was, quote, one of the first American fashion trends to transcend the class divide. It was appropriate for working in a factory or attending a temperance or ladies' auxiliary meeting, end quote.
It was practical, fashionable, and most importantly, in incredibly high demand, especially among the growing number of working women. This high demand created a boom for factories, particularly those that could produce these garments quickly and cheaply. Another source states, quote, the shirtwaist was a new item, styled after menswear, and was looser and more liberating than Victorian-style bodices, end quote. They were flying off the shelves.
And this brings us to the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, nestled within the seemingly modern Ash Building in Manhattan. Picture this. A 10-story building, the factory occupying the top 3 floors. One source notes, quote, the company employed 500 mostly Italian and Jewish immigrants between the ages of 13 and 23, end quote. And it sounds almost impressive, right? A bustling hub of production, a testament to American ingenuity. Another source even stated that the Triangle Factory was a much more modern factory environment. High ceilings, big windows. For the times, this factory was rather modern.
On the surface, yes, but that's where the illusion ends and the grim reality begins. The Triangle Factory, for all its modern trappings, was a sweatshop through and through. We're talking 500 workers, mostly young immigrant women, many of whom couldn't even speak English, crammed like sardines into a densely packed place. They worked grueling 11 to 12-hour days and sometimes even longer.
And for what? These women were barely making enough to survive. One source tells us that a worker at the Triangle Factory could expect to earn between $7 and $12 a week for a 52-hour work week. To put that in perspective, that's roughly $300 a week in today's money. Another source states that some workers made only $3 a week. And on top of that, the factory owners would often dock their pay for needles, thread, and even the electricity they used. As one worker, Clara Lemlich, powerfully stated, these conditions reduced workers to the status of machines.
It's a chilling picture, isn't it? Long hours, pitiful wages, and a work environment that was not just uncomfortable but actively dangerous. These factories were often poorly ventilated, filled with flammable materials, and even the most basic safety precautions were lacking. The conditions were appalling. A contemporary poem paints this haunting picture for us. Quote, "The sweatshop was a stuffy room with but a single door. The windows, they were gray with dust from off that dirty floor. There were no comforts, no fresh air, no light to sew thereby, and the girls, they toiled from early morn till darkness filled the sky."
So here we have it. A city obsessed with progress, a booming industry built on exploitation, and a factory packed to the rafters with vulnerable workers. It was a recipe for disaster. A disaster that was not just predictable, but in many ways inevitable.
The tinder was piled high, Alana, and all it needed was a spark. And on March 25th, 1911, that spark came. We've painted the picture of a city and an industry built on the powder keg of inequality and exploitation. Now we step into the inferno. March 25th, 1911, a Saturday, and the workday at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory was almost over. But then, disaster struck.
Around 4:40 p.m., as the last few workers were preparing to leave, a fire ignited on the 8th floor. The likely culprit? A carelessly discarded cigarette or match, igniting a bin overflowing with highly flammable cotton scraps known as cutaways. One source vividly highlights the danger, explaining that the factory could accumulate over a ton of this material. Just imagine that, a literal ton of fuel just waiting for a spark.
And that spark came. What began as a small, seemingly manageable fire quickly spiraled out of control, consuming the 8th, 9th, and 10th floors in a matter of minutes. This wasn't just an accident, Alana. This was, as one source so powerfully states, quote, a man-made disaster. A disaster born from negligence, greed, and a blatant disregard for human life.
Exactly, Michael. And the events that followed are a horrifying testament to that disregard. The factory was a death trap. No sprinkler system, a fire hose that was rotted through, its valve rusted shut. One source starkly notes that city officials had allowed the Ash building to erect a single flimsy fire escape instead of the required third staircase. A single inadequate fire escape that, under the weight of desperate workers, collapsed.
The scene was absolute chaos. Workers, trapped by the rapidly spreading flames, found their escape routes blocked. Some tried the elevators, but only one was working, and it could only carry a few people at a time. Others rushed for the fire escape, a decision that proved fatal for many. And then there were the doors, some of them locked.
The locked doors. It's a detail that still chills me to the bone. It was a common practice for factory owners to lock doors, supposedly to prevent theft or unauthorized breaks. But on that day, those locked doors sealed the fate of countless workers. As one source confirms, quote, the owners had locked the factory doors to keep workers from leaving early, end quote.
Trapped between the advancing flames and locked doors, many workers made a desperate, unthinkable choice. They jumped. Witnesses described a horrifying scene, the sickening thud of bodies hitting the pavement below. One eyewitness horrifically stated, quote, I learned a new sound that day, a sound more horrible than description can picture, the thud of a speeding, living body on a sown sidewalk.
And the firefighters, when they finally arrived, were tragically unprepared for this kind of inferno. One source explained that, quote, the ladders of Company 20 extended only to the 6th floor, and life nets broke when workers jumped in groups of 3 and 4, end quote. One firefighter, overwhelmed by the scene, lamented that, quote, there was no apparatus in the department to cope with this kind of fire, end quote. It was a complete and utter failure on every level.
The fire was swift, lasting a mere 18 minutes, but claimed the lives of 146 people. Quote, the fire was practically all over in a half an hour, one source states, yet it was, quote, the most murderous fire that New York had seen in many years, end quote. Most of the victims were young women, immigrants who had come to America with dreams of a better life, only to meet a horrific end in a nightmare factory that valued profits over their very existence. Until the devastating attacks of 9/11, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire stood as the deadliest workplace disaster in New York City history, a chilling reminder of the human cost of unchecked industrial greed.
And this wasn't just a fire, Michael. It was a massacre, a direct result of systematic failures and a callous disregard for human life. But amid the horror, amidst the ashes, something else began to stir. Outrage, a collective cry for justice that would eventually lead to change.
And that's where we're heading next. The aftermath, the outrage, and the fight for a better future. How did this tragedy ignite a movement? And what legacy did it leave behind? Join us as we continue to explore the haunting story of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. We've painted a picture of a city and an industry built on a powder keg of inequality and exploitation and the horrific crime that resulted in the deaths of over 140 persons.
But to fully grasp the impact of that outrage, we need to understand the historical context. This fire didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened during a time of immense social and economic upheaval in America, the Gilded Age.
You're absolutely right, Alana. To truly understand the significance of the Triangle Fire, we have to rewind a bit and look at the larger picture of labor relations in America during the late 19th century. The Gilded Age, as it is often called, sounds glamorous, right? But that's a deceptive veneer. It was a time of incredible industrial growth, yes, but also of brutal exploitation and massive inequality.
Exactly. Post-Civil War America was transformed by technological advancements and the rise of these huge corporations. We're talking about the age of steel, railroads, and oil, industries that created immense wealth for a select few, the so-called robber barons like Carnegie, Vanderbilt, Morgan, and Rockefeller. The success of men and the monopolies they built were dependent on the labor of a vast and often mistreated workforce. Imagine millions of workers, including women and children, laboring for endless hours in dangerous conditions, all for wages that barely kept them afloat.
And when those workers tried to organize, to fight for better conditions, they were met with fierce, often violent resistance. Employers used blacklisting. They hired strikebreakers. They even resorted to violence to crush any attempts at unionization. The late 19th century is filled with these intense, often bloody labor conflicts.
The Great Railroad Strike of 1877, for example. It was a nationwide uprising, a spontaneous outburst of rage against wage cuts and poor working conditions. The strikes were brutally put down, but they showed the simmering discontent among American workers.
And then the Haymarket Affair of 1886, a peaceful protest for an 8-hour workday in Chicago turned into a riot after a bomb was thrown. The aftermath was a disaster for the labor movement. Labor leaders were arrested, tried, and some were even executed, even though there was little evidence connecting them to the bombing. One source notes that the Haymarket affair led to the demonization of the labor movement itself. Those that wanted to create unions or even be members of unions were seen as against American progress and even un-American.
The Homestead Strike of 1892 at Carnegie's steel mill was another brutal example. When workers went on strike, the company brought in Pinkerton detectives, essentially a private army, leading to a violent confrontation that left several people dead. The state militia eventually intervened, not to protect the workers, but to break the strike and crush the union. The message was clear. Organized labor would not be tolerated by the government or corporations.
And let's not forget the Pullman Strike of 1894, a nationwide railroad strike sparked by wage cuts at the Pullman Palace Car Company. The federal government stepped in, siding with the company and using the military to break the strike. One source says that the Pullman strike, quote, represents a low point in Washington's insensitivity to the conditions of workers.
And these strikes, and there were many others, tell us something crucial about labor in the Gilded Age. This was an era of intense struggle, with workers fighting tooth and nail for every small gain. While unions, like the American Federation of Labor, or the AFL, had some success in organizing skilled workers, the majority of workers, especially immigrant women who worked in garment factories, were often left out in the cold. Many in the labor movement did not want to associate with immigrants or women.
But this did not stop women from trying to organize themselves into unions. In fact, women workers at the Triangle Shirtwaist Company did just that. Next, let's take a deeper dive into the working conditions and strikes that preceded the fire. The Triangle Factory, owned by Max Blanc and Isaac Harris, wasn't just any factory. It was a major player, one of the biggest shirtwaist manufacturers in New York City, possibly even the entire country. As we talked about earlier, they employed around 500 people, mostly young women and immigrants, many from Jewish backgrounds. These women often worked grueling 12-hour days, sometimes even longer, for meager wages in conditions that were, to put it mildly, far from ideal.
And it wasn't just the long hours and low pay. The factory itself, located in the Ash Building, a modern high-rise, might have seemed impressive from the outside, but inside it was a different story. The fact that so many workers were concentrated in one building actually fostered a sense of solidarity among them. They saw each other's struggles, shared the same grievances, and that shared experience became a powerful force.
It's a double-edged sword, isn't it? Proximity can breed both community and a heightened awareness of shared problems. And in the Triangle Factory, those problems were glaring. Safety regulations were practically non-existent.
Exactly. So in the fall of 1909, 2 years before the fire, that simmering discontent boiled over. The workers at the Triangle Factory, along with thousands of other garment workers across the city, went on strike. This was the Uprising of the 20,000, as it was called, a massive strike spearheaded by the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, or the ILGWU.
And the spark for that uprising, the voice that galvanized the workers, was a young immigrant woman named Clara Lemlich.
Clara Lemlich. Remember that name. She was only 23 years old, a Ukrainian immigrant, and she had the courage to stand up and say, enough is enough. During a pivotal meeting, she famously declared, quote, I have listened to all the speakers and I don't want to talk anymore. I move we go on a general strike, end quote.
Her words ignited the crowd. It's a powerful example of how one person, one voice can make a difference. And it highlights the crucial role of women in the labor movement, particularly immigrant women, whose contributions are often overlooked. The women who worked in these garment factories were often ignored by the male-dominated labor movement.
The demands of the Triangle workers and the other striking garment workers were simple yet radical for the time. Higher pay, shorter hours, safer working conditions, and crucially, union recognition. But Blanc and Harris, the owners of the Triangle Factory, were staunchly anti-union.
It's interesting, isn't it? Blanc and Harris were immigrants themselves. They had come to America and built their businesses from the ground up. But their perspective was entirely that of the greedy bosses. They saw unions as a threat to their profits and their control. They viewed the strike itself as a personal attack. They had built their businesses as far as they were concerned, and they weren't about to let a union dictate how they ran it.
And they fought back hard. They hired private security, thugs really, to intimidate and attack the picketing workers. They even colluded with the police, paying them off to turn a blind eye to the violence. One source described how they used private detective agencies to provide replacement workers and even hired prostitutes at one point to start fights with the strikers.
It's astonishing the lengths that they went to. But despite the violence, despite the intimidation, these women persisted. They picketed day in and day out, facing down threats and violence and abuse. It's a testament to the courage of their determination.
The strike at the Triangle Factory, however, was ultimately unsuccessful in achieving its main goal, union recognition. While some garment manufacturers eventually caved and signed union contracts, Blanc and Harris held firm. The Triangle workers did win some improvement in wages and hours, but they went back to work without a union, without that crucial protection.
And that's the heart of the tragedy, isn't it? They went back to work without a union, which meant they had no real power to enforce those improved safety conditions they demanded, the very conditions that might have prevented the fire 2 years later. Two of the more pressing demands, adequate fire escapes and open doors from the factories to the streets, were ignored.
And now, 2 years later, when the fire broke out in the Triangle Factory, those ignored safety precautions and negligence directly led to the death of 146 people. Let's turn now to the aftermath of the fire, because surely someone would be held accountable for this disaster.
Let's talk about the trial of Isaac Harris and Max Blanc, the owners of the Triangle Shirtwaist Company. They were indicted on charges of first and second degree manslaughter. The prosecution argued that they knew the exit doors were locked, violating city and state codes, and that this negligence directly led to the deaths of the workers.
It sounds like a pretty open and shut case. What was the defense's strategy?
That's where the story gets complicated. Harris and Blanc hired Max Steuer, who was known as one of New York's most expensive lawyers. Steuer focused on discrediting the witnesses' testimonies.
And Steuer was ruthless. For example, there's the story of Kate Alterman, a survivor. Steuer had her repeat her testimony multiple times, and because she didn't change key phrases, he argued that she and other witnesses from the fire had memorized their statements or were told what to say by the prosecutors.
Exactly. He also played on biases against the young immigrant women who worked at the Triangle Factory. He questioned their morality and tried to paint them as irresponsible, suggesting that the panic contributed to their deaths, not the lack of safety precautions.
So was Steuer able to sway the jury?
In the end, yes. The jury acquitted Harris and Blanc of all charges. The main reason cited was that the prosecution couldn't prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the owners knew that the door was locked at the time of the fire.
And it gets worse. After the acquittal, Harris and Blanc even tried to rebuild their business.
God, you've got to be kidding me.
Nope. They opened a new factory. And in 1913, Blanc was arrested again for locking a door during working hours. He was only fined $20, the minimum possible fine.
Which, of course, is laughable. Later in 1913, a civil suit was brought against Blanc and Harris in 1913 for their part in the deaths of these workers in the Triangle Fire. They were found guilty, and the plaintiffs were awarded compensation, a measly $75 per deceased victim. In contrast, the insurance company paid Blanc and Harris about $60,000 more than their reported losses, which means they made a profit on the fire.
It's hard to believe there was so little justice. It's enraging that they profited even after such a horrific event.
It is. But the public outcry and the clear failures of the legal system fueled a push for better workplace safety laws and regulations. Despite the immense tragedy and the disappointing trial, the fire and its aftermath became a catalyst for change in labor laws and safety standards. The fire galvanized the progressive movement, a period already marked by calls for social reform. Progressives, a diverse coalition of reformers, were already working to address issues like poverty, corruption, and unsafe working conditions. But the Triangle Fire and the sheer scale of the tragedy brought these issues into sharp focus. It became a symbol of everything that was wrong with unregulated industrial capitalism.
The progressive movement was already in motion before the fire, campaigning for reforms in American society between 1890 and the start of World War I. But the fire gave it a new sense of urgency, a powerful rallying cry. It provided undeniable, heartbreaking evidence of the need for government intervention and regulation to protect workers.
And the public response was overwhelming. The grief and outrage were palpable. Just a week after the fire, 80,000 people marched in protest on Fifth Avenue, where the very wealthy lived. A week after that, over 350,000 participated in a funeral march for the Triangle Factory victims. These weren't just empty gestures. They were powerful displays of solidarity and a demand for justice.
That public pressure, that collective outcry, led directly to the creation of the Factory Investigating Commission, or FIC, in June of 1911. This wasn't just a committee formed to write a report and then be forgotten. The FIC had teeth. Its purpose was to investigate the conditions under which manufacturing is carried on. It was a direct response to the tragedy, and it marked a turning point in the government's approach to workplace safety.
It's a great example of how a crisis can force a shift in priorities, even within established power structures. And the FIC didn't mess around. They conducted sweeping investigation, examining over 3,000 workplaces and holding public hearings. They interviewed 222 witnesses and took 3,500 pages of testimony. They were meticulous, gathering data, inspecting factories firsthand, and importantly, using the power of publicity to expose the dangerous and exploitative conditions they found. They understood that public awareness was crucial to driving this change. By 1913, the Commission had recommended 64 new laws, with 60 of them being enacted.
And those laws were transformative. The FIC's work led directly to new legislation in New York, including the Sullivan-Hoey Fire Prevention Law, which mandated sprinkler systems in all factories. Think about that. A direct line from the tragedy of the fire to a concrete law that would save countless lives in the future.
And it wasn't just sprinklers. We're talking about comprehensive reforms, requirements for fire escapes, outward swinging doors, limits on working hours for women and children, and improved sanitation. The FIC's work had a ripple effect outside of New York, influencing workplace safety regulations across the country, serving as a model for state and national codes.
We've recounted the horrifying events of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, the lives lost, the immediate aftermath, and the reforms that followed. But the story doesn't end there. The fire's legacy continues to resonate today, shaping our understanding of labor rights, workplace safety, and social responsibility.
Exactly, Alana. The fire is a powerful reminder of what can happen when industrialization runs unchecked, when profit is prioritized over human life. It's a cautionary tale, as one source notes, that helped to refine the American industrial workplace. It forced a reckoning, a fundamental shift in how society viewed the relationship between employers, workers, and the government.
And that shift wasn't just about passing new laws. It was about changing attitudes. The fire helped to solidify the idea that workers have a fundamental right to a safe working environment, that it's not a privilege granted by employers, but a basic human right.
We encourage our listeners to learn more about the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire and its legacy. Visit the website on the Remember the Triangle Fire Coalition. Explore the resources available at Cornell University ILR School's Kiel Center, and engage in conversations about labor rights in your own community. Thank you for joining us on History's Greatest Crimes.
Until next time, remember the past and fight for a better future.